All right, today we're going to pull back the curtain on a really powerful piece of persuasion. We're going to deconstruct a sermon that builds its entire massive argument on just one single, kind of haunting word: almost.
So this is the core idea, right? This is the engine that drives the whole thing. The sermon kicks off by establishing this as an absolute truth, that getting super close but just falling short is exactly the same as not even trying. And it's a concept that, feels universally and sometimes painfully true for all of us.
To make this idea really hit home, the sermon opens with this incredibly powerful analogy: the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Now think about this. Out of 10 million parts, every single one worked perfectly, except for one. But that one failed O-ring seal, that one tiny part, was enough to cause that catastrophic explosion, killing all 7 crew members. It's just a brutal illustration of the point. 99.999% success was still total, utter failure. Almost perfect was nowhere close.
And from there, the sermon just starts stacking up these examples of almosts. It brings up all these famous biblical stories of near misses. You've got the Israelites who died out in the desert, literally on the doorstep of the Promised Land. The wealthy young man who just couldn't bring himself to give up his stuff to follow Jesus. And even Judas, who was right there for all the miracles but in the end completely missed the point. Every story is meant to reinforce this feeling of tragic failure right at the finish line, which perfectly sets the stage for the main event.
Okay, so after setting that stage, the sermon zeroes in on its central case study, and this one comes from the book of Acts. The scene is incredibly dramatic. You have a prisoner in chains, the Apostle Paul, and he's brought before royalty, King Agrippa. It's this high-stakes showdown between worldly power and religious faith.
So you might be wondering, how did this meeting even happen? Well, it's a bit of a political mess, really. Paul gets arrested, but the Roman governor, a guy named Festus, can't find any real crime he's committed. So, to get away from his accusers, Paul, who's a Roman citizen, plays his trump card. He appeals directly to Caesar. This puts Festus in a really awkward spot. He has to send Paul to Rome, but he has no formal charges to write down in his report. So when King Agrippa comes to visit, Festus basically says, "Hey, can you listen to this guy and help me figure out what on earth to write?"
And what was this huge, world-shaking crime Paul was accused of? It was simply this. He was going around telling people that a man named Jesus had been crucified, had died, and then came back to life 3 days later. A pretty simple message, but it was one that was turning their entire world upside down.
Okay, so now we get to the heart of it. The sermon starts to dissect this encounter, and it identifies 3 specific keys to persuasion that it claims brought King Agrippa right to the very edge of changing his entire life.
According to the sermon, it wasn't just one thing that got to Agrippa. It was this potent combination of 3 things. First, the sheer power and authority of the holy texts themselves. Second, the undeniable raw sincerity of the speaker, Paul. And third, the massive emotional weight of the core message about a Savior. So let's unpack each of these.
The first key is what the sermon calls the power of the Scriptures. The argument here is that King Agrippa was already an expert in the prophecies of the Old Testament. So Paul wasn't really bringing him some brand new idea. He was basically just connecting the dots, arguing that this Jesus was the fulfillment of everything Agrippa had already been taught to believe. The sermon really leans into this idea that faith comes by hearing the word. Next up, the sermon looks at the messenger himself, Paul. It argues that what really moved Agrippa was Paul's incredible sincerity. I mean, think about it. Paul wasn't trying to get out of jail or score points with the king. His whole appeal was driven by a genuine, deep belief and a real concern for Agrippa's soul. And that kind of authenticity, the sermon claims, is an incredibly persuasive tool.
But here's the thing. This sincerity, this passion, it looked like complete madness to other people. Governor Festus literally screams at him, "You are out of your mind, Paul." And the sermon uses this moment to make a much broader point about our society. It argues that we see someone with extreme dedication to their job or a sport, and we say, "Wow, they're so dedicated." That's normal. But when someone shows that exact same level of devotion to God, they often get dismissed as a fanatic, or as Festus put it, just plain crazy.
And this brings us to the third and maybe the most crucial key, the emotional heart of the message. Paul doesn't just lay out facts. The sermon says he took the man to Calvary, to the place of the crucifixion. He makes the whole story intensely personal, framing it as a sacrifice made specifically for King Agrippa. This direct emotional appeal is presented as the most powerful persuasive weapon of all.
So, after getting hit with this powerful three-part argument, Agrippa famously says, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" He was so close. He was almost there. And this brings us right to the sermon's dramatic turning point. Why, after all that, did he ultimately walk away?
This is the question the whole rest of the sermon is built to answer. After everything, the logic of the scriptures, the sincerity of the speaker, the emotional power of the message, what stopped him? Why did he pull back right from the edge of that decision?
So the sermon basically gives this three-part psychological breakdown of what was going on in Agrippa's head. It argues that he rejected the message because, number one, he valued his sin more than salvation. Number two, he valued the applause of other people more than the approval of God. And number three, he valued his temporary life more than a permanent eternity.
The first reason is, well, it's pretty blunt. The sermon claims Agrippa had a very specific sin he just wasn't willing to let go of: his relationship with his sister, Bernice. And get this, she was sitting right there in the room while Paul was giving his speech. The sermon's argument is that Agrippa knew, deep down, that becoming a Christian would mean giving her up, and for him, that price was just too high.
Okay, reason number two is all about social pressure. I mean, just picture the scene. Agrippa is the king. He looks over at Governor Festus, a powerful Roman who respects him. He looks at his sister Bernice. The sermon speculates that he was terrified of what they would think. Would they laugh at him? Would he lose his power, his authority, his whole macho image if he gave in to this prisoner's preaching?
And finally, the third reason, it's all about perspective. Agrippa was a man of this world, a world of power, of politics, of stuff, a world that runs on the clock. The sermon argues he was so focused on the temporary, on the here and now, that he was completely blind to the eternal. As the source text puts it, we are not made for time, we are made for eternity.
And this is where everything circles back to the beginning, back to that opening theme. It's not just a story about some king from 2,000 years ago anymore. It becomes a direct, urgent warning about the really stark consequences of being only almost persuaded.
And the sermon doesn't pull any punches here. There are no soft edges. The definition is totally black and white. To be almost a Christian, it claims, is to not be a Christian at all. And in the logic of this argument, the final outcome is exactly the same as for someone who never even thought about it. The stakes are presented as eternally, unimaginably high.
So, when we step back from the sermon itself, what can we take away from this deconstruction? It really leaves us with a compelling question to think about. Whether you agree with the message or not, its structure is, you have to admit, a masterclass in persuasion. It makes you wonder, how do these powerful stories, these narratives that use a perfect blend of emotion, logic, and social pressure, how do they end up shaping our own most critical moments of decision?